Lectures on the Basics of Biblical Greek. Chapter 17 on Contract Verbs. Let's review a bit what we know about the present active indicative. The present active indicative consists of three parts. The present stem, which is the most basic form of the verb. One recovers the present stem by removing the connecting vowel and personal endings, as in the examples on the screen. To the present stem, a connecting vowel is added, omicron before personal endings that start with mu or nu, epsilon before other personal endings, and either omicron or epsilon if no personal ending is used. Again, notice the highlighted connecting vowels. The primary active endings are first person singular, nothing. Second person singular is a sigma. Third person singular is iota. First person plural, mu, epsilon, nu. Second person plural is tau, epsilon. Third person plural is nu, sigma, iota. These are the primary active endings, and they're used on the present active indicative, along with some other forms. When stem and connecting vowel and personal ending are put together, the inflected forms of the present active indicative are, as in the example above, leo, lies, liae, liamen, liate, liusi. In our lesson for today, we are not going to learn any more personal endings, but we will learn how those connecting vowels and personal endings combine with stems that end in short vowels, omicron, epsilon, or alpha. These stems that end in short vowels are called contract verbs. So we'll first of all define what a contract verb is. Then we'll work our way through the 5 primary rules of contraction, plus 1. We'll look at the 3 major contract paradigms, and then practice taking a contracted verb apart, uncontracting. For it is when one uncontracts the verb that one can clearly see the connecting vowel and personal ending. So what is a contract verb? A contract verb is a verb where the verbal stem, present stem, ends in an alpha, epsilon, or omicron. The 3 paradigm examples are agapao, notice the alpha, poieo, notice the epsilon, and pleroo, notice the omicron. Please notice them now because of what happens when they actually occur in usage. See, when the stem vowel meets the connecting vowel and ending, contraction occurs, and the stem vowel is no longer clearly visible. So although the uncontracted form of the verb to love is agapao, the form that one will see in the Greek text is agapo. Notice the alpha isn't visible anymore. It has contracted with the omega. The same is true of poieo, which contracts to poio, and pleroo, which contracts to plero. So how exactly does contraction work? There are 5 major rules. We'll step through them now. We'll add one additional rule that I think is particularly important, and then we'll look at the paradigms. Rule number 1. The combination of epsilon, omicron, or omicron, epsilon, or 2 omicrons contracts to omicron, upsilon. So, poi-amen contracts to poi-umen. Epsilon plus omicron contracts to omicron, upsilon. Similarly, pleroo-ete contracts to plerute, and play ra amen contracts to play rumen. This is rule 1. Rule 2. If two epsilons occur together in an uncontracted form, they contract together to make epsilon iota, the diphthong. So poi ete contracts to poieta. And you can hear in the enunciation why the contraction was necessary. By the way, the uncontracted forms never occur in Greek language, only the contracted forms. This is rule number 2. Rule number 3 is a bit more complex. With the exceptions of the contractions involving omicron in rule number 1, omicron epsilon, epsilon omicron, or 2 omicrons, with the exception of those, any other combination of omicron or omega plus a vowel contracts to omega. So, for example, agapa plus amen, the alpha plus the omicron contract to omega. According to rule number 4, the combination alpha plus epsilon contracts to alpha. So agapa plus ete contracts to agapate. Likewise, the combination of agapa plus a, epsilon iota, contracts to agapa. Alpha and epsilon contracting to alpha, and the leftover iota subscripting. That one's a little tricky, I admit. The last of the big 5 rules is the reverse of the previous one. Here the sequence is epsilon alpha. If that sequence occurs, it contracts to eta. Now, the only example we can show you of this occurring involves a personal ending from the primary middle passive set. That personal ending is psi. And when that combines with poiet, the sigma drops out. Then we have the combination of epsilon alpha, which contracts to eta with a leftover iota that then subscripts. So this one is real tricky, poie. But we won't face that until a future lesson. These are the 5 major rules of contraction. You need to commit them to memory. Rule 4 and 5 are easily confused unless one notices that in the combination alpha epsilon, the alpha is first and therefore it contracts to alpha, whereas if the combination is the other way around, it contracts to eta. These rules have only to do with an explanation for the forms as we see them in Greek literature. Contractions have nothing to do with meaning. A first-person plural is the same whether it's with a contracted verb or a non-contracted verb when it comes to translation. There is a 6th rule. It's not in the big 5, but I feel it almost as important because we run into it twice with pleirao, namely the combination of omicron plus epsilon plus iota. It contracts to omicron iota. So pleirao, pleira plus ace becomes pleirois, and pleira plus a becomes pleiroi. These look so much like nouns that it's important to know this rule. As challenging as these rules may seem at first, once you've been working with them for a while, they're not that difficult. But as you will quickly come to observe, working with contract verbs truly requires that you know agapao is an alpha contract and poieo is an epsilon contract and play ra'o is an omicron contract because you will rarely see the actual contract vowel appearing in Greek literature. So it's necessary to know what the vowel is in order to take the word apart. There's one other situation with which we must deal, and that's when a contract vowel meets up with a diphthong. If the contract vowel and the first vowel of the diphthong are the same, then they simplify. So poiet plus ace, it just simplifies to poies. However, if the contract vowel and the first vowel of the diphthong are different, they contract. So in the example of poiet plus usi, the vowel of the diphthong is different, and so epsilon plus omicron by rule 1 contracts to omicron upsilon, and the second upsilon just disappears. As you may have discerned, there are three primary paradigms because there are three types of contract verbs, those that end in alpha, epsilon, or omicron. We'll use our paradigms, agapao, poieo, and pleirao, to illustrate the formation of these endings, show you what they look like. Alpha contracts consist of the stem vowel alpha plus the connecting vowel and ending. They contract according to the following rules. Agapo reflects rule 3, alpha plus omega. Agapas reflects rule number 4, where alpha plus epsilon equals alpha and the iota subscripts. Same thing is true of agapa, the third singular. It also reflects rule 4. In the first person plural, the alpha plus omicron, according to rule 3, contracts to omega. Therefore, the form is agapomen. Alpha plus epsilon contracts to alpha, according to rule 4. So the contracted second person plural is agapate. And in the third person plural, we have a diphthong, but its vowel, its leading vowel, is different from the initial vowel, and so those vowels contract, and alpha plus omicron falls under rule 3. Thus, agapa plus usi becomes agaposi. Alpha plus omicron equals omega. Omega plus upsilon equals omega. Now the epsilon contracts. Again, epsilon plus omega, rule 3. We should be used to that by now. Poio. Epsilon plus epsilon iota sigma. There the diphthong's leading vowel is the same as the contract vowel, so it simplifies to poies. Same thing true with poie, a diphthong that simplifies. In the plurals, the first person plural, epsilon plus omicron, rule number 1 becomes the diphthong omicron upsilon. Epsilon plus epsilon tau epsilon, the second person plural, that's rule number 2. Epsilon plus epsilon contracts to epsilon iota. And the third person plural is epsilon plus a diphthong that starts with a vowel different from it, so the contraction occurs to usi. The third paradigm is the combination of omicron plus the personal endings. Again, rule 3 gets us started because omega plus any other vowel contracts to omega. Rule 6 applies, the special case rule, in the second and third person singular, where the combination of omicron, epsilon, and iota contracts to omicron iota, pleirois and pleiroi. In the plurals, omicron plus omicron by rule number 1 contracts to omicron upsilon, pleirumen. Omicron epsilon also follows rule number 1. So the contraction is pleirute for the second person plural. And Omicron plus the diphthong, Omicron upsilon, follows the simplification rule. Namely, the initial vowel of the diphthong is identical to the contract vowel, and it just simplifies. Now let's practice what you will do when you meet a contract verb in a sentence. The best way to parse the verb is to uncontract the form so that you can fully see the connecting vowel and the personal ending and get the parsing correctly. You are reading a sentence in Greek and you come across the form poiumen. It's from a contract verb. To get the parsing correctly, you will then uncontract the form so that you can see clearly how to parse it. Well, poiumen, you will know from your vocabulary, has a stem poia. So write down the stem poia. And then ask the question, epsilon plus what gives the diphthong upsilon? Well, according to rule number 1, it's epsilon plus omicron. Supply the omicron, and one can clearly then see the personal ending omicron mu epsilon nu and parse the form easily, first person plural. The second example is a bit harder. Pleirois almost looks like it could be a dative plural, but it's a verb. You know that from mastering your vocabulary. And what's more, you know, according to the vocabulary, that the stem vowel of this verb is an omicron. Its stem is pleira. So what would yield omicron iota from a combination that starts with an omicron? Here, rule number 6 applies. Omicron plus epsilon plus iota equals omicron iota. Supply the epsilon iota, and you can clearly see it's a second person singular. The third example is agapate. Again, you know from your vocabulary that the stem is agapa. So what combines with alpha to give alpha? Rule number 4, alpha plus epsilon. Supply the epsilon, and you can clearly see the second person plural personal ending, ete. Of course, if you've been looking at these quite carefully, you'll notice that even before taking the verb apart, uncontracting it, you can still parse the form. The first example, poiumen, mu epsilon nu, that's first person plural. The second example, ignore the vowel, the sigma, you know that's second person singular. The third example, again, ignore the contraction. You already know that tau epsilon is the second person plural. In many ways, you can parse these forms without even doing the work of uncontracting them. So they're not as hard as they look when it comes to parsing and translation. In this lesson, we've defined a contract verb as a verb, the stem of which ends in either alpha or epsilon or omicron. We've looked at the 5 major rules of contraction, plus 1 extra rule. We've gone through the 3 major paradigms, agapao, poieo, and pleirao, and we've done a little practice uncontracting the forms. It's now up to you to do further practice and raise your questions on the discussion board so that we can master this topic.